Hi, and good evening. I'm here today to talk about a stolen vision of an alternative to settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is that distinct form of colonization characterized by the arrival of settlers who quickly come to regard a territory as something they are inheriting from their forefathers, as opposed to taking from Indigenous people. Settler colonialism values Indigenous land, not Indigenous labor, or Indigenous culture, or Indigenous knowledge. Under settler colonialism, Indigenous people are defined as a problem because they block access to valuable lands and resources. And once Indigenous people are displaced by settlers, they additionally become labeled as people with problems. Problems, of course, that resulted from having been colonized. The pervasiveness and the general sameness of settler colonialism has conditioned us to think that maybe the systematic displacement of Indigenous people was inevitable, that there never were any workable alternatives. And so people understandably say there can be no reconciliation because there never was an earlier conciliation. But in fact, history suggests otherwise. An alternative to settler colonialism did exist, but it was stolen away from us and then hidden. My name is Keith Carlson, and I hold the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous History and Indigenous and Community-Engaged History at the University of the Fraser Valley. I've been learning with and from Indigenous people, and in particular the Stalo people of the Fraser watershed, for the last 3 decades. Tonight, I'd like to invite you to join me on a little journey to reflect upon how settler colonialism came to take the form that it has, and to think about who we are and who we could be or become in our relationship with Indigenous people and Indigenous lands. For me, this journey began in earnest with a plate of home-baked cookies back in June of 1992. I was visiting with a knowledge keeper from the Ts'alis community on the Harrison River. The elder was a kind and gentle woman and one of the last fluent Halkmalan speakers in the Stalo community. As we visited, she discussed the ways that settler colonialism had impacted her community. And in the course of our conversation, she explained to me that in her language, the word for Indigenous people was Huelmoch, which meant people of life. And I practiced pronouncing it with her. And then she asked me if I'd like to know the word in Halkmalan for non-Indigenous people, like myself. I answered yes, and she smiled and she passed me the plate of cookies. And as I took a bite of the first cookie, she said, "The word is Huelitum." "Do you want to know what that word means?" she asked. "What Huelitum means?" Well, it means hungry people, people who are so hungry they are literally starving. And then with a giggle, she asked if I was hungry and if I'd like another cookie. I've reflected many times on that conversation. And despite the fact that my career has largely focused on working with Indigenous communities to help them document and understand their own history, my research has inevitably become part of an ever deeper critical examination of the history of Huelitum, the hungry people of settler colonialism. Now, when exactly the term Huelitum first emerged as a way of collectively defining non-Indigenous people, it's not certain. It may have arisen as early as when the first explorer, Simon Fraser, had to cache all of his food supplies and then portage along the edge of steep mountain ravines in the Fraser Canyon to get down into the Stalo world. He arrived from above the rapids with nothing and was literally starving, literally hungry and dependent upon the Indigenous people. But whatever the origin, Huelitum became solidified as a way of understanding non-Indigenous newcomers following the sudden arrival in 1858 of more than 30,000 miners. These were men who had no interest in forming relationships with Indigenous people and who brazenly demonstrated an insatiable appetite for Indigenous lands and resources. And they were immediately followed by an even hungrier population, a population led by corrupt land speculators and developers, many of whom held positions of power in the new colonial government. And these men hoped and expected that Indigenous settler relations here in BC would necessarily follow a similar pattern to what had recently unfolded in neighboring jurisdictions. Places such as California, where a genocidal war of extermination had recently resulted in the murdering of as many as 16,000 Indigenous men, women, and children, where hundreds of thousands were literally starved or worked to death, and where between 10 and 27,000, mostly children, were taken as slaves. Or Oregon Territory, where a decade earlier, the American government had attempted to relocate coastal people to collective reserves west of the Rocky Mountains. And in adjacent Washington Territory, where, in the wake of the 1854 smallpox epidemic, the American Army had waged a 2-year war against Indigenous people. But there were others who regarded this future as neither desirable nor inevitable. Indigenous people were aware of what was happening south of the Medicine Line, and they made their concerns known to Governor James Douglas. Douglas was a former fur trader whose wife was Indigenous and who was himself of African ancestry. Douglas traveled extensively throughout the colony, speaking with Indigenous peoples, and collaboratively they conceived an alternative vision that rejected unbridled Hualitum hunger, a vision that was for its day remarkably inclusive, compassionate, and reciprocal. This vision pushed back against Hualitum hunger and challenged principles of settler colonialism as they had emerged elsewhere. It provided and secured to Indigenous people the right to hunt and gather on unclaimed Crown lands, the right to continue their fisheries as before, the establishment of large anticipatory reserves designed to not only accommodate their existing land use patterns and activities, but to account for future participation in the commercial economy. Additional special Indigenous-only commercial reserves were set aside for mining. Compensation for lands alienated outside the reserve were going to be accounted for. The right to preempt land freely, like white settlers, was guaranteed, and the right to register commercial activities and businesses was secured, and a continuation of the right to self-governance. However, when Governor Douglas retired in 1864 and the establishment of BC's first electoral council took place, this vision of a shared community was denounced and the associated policies and promises were disavowed. Reserves were dramatically reduced. Indigenous people's ability to access land and resources off of their reserves was drastically curtailed. The right to acquire either private or public lands and have them licensed was eliminated. Indigenous people were no longer appointed to positions in the government as magistrates, and they were now denied the ability to vote in federal elections, a right that was not secured to them again until 1960, by which time they no longer were an effective, threatening demographic. And no compensation, of course, was ever provided for alienated lands. And beyond this, over the coming decade, Indigenous settler government went on to outlaw Indigenous self-governance through the potlatch, to criminalize Indigenous spirituality through the winter dance, to ban the in-river commercial fishery, and to establish a formal system of assimilations that we know as residential schools. And as a result of these changes and these positions, Indigenous people became impoverished and marginalized, while Hualitum hunger continued to grow. Now, the vision that James Douglas and Indigenous leaders advanced would not have been perfect, but it would have, I believe, created a system where Indigenous issues and voices were central to land, water, and resource planning. It would have expanded Canada's system of federalism, and it would have provided settlers and Indigenous people alike with opportunities to get to know, understand, and presumably respect one another, things that simply were not possible in the system that was created in its place. Instead, as Hualitums, as we went on to build equity in our homes, Indigenous people were fighting to protect their ancestral lands from the cumulative effects of industrial and commercial development. As we were voting for government officials to represent our interests, Indigenous people were struggling just to be heard. As we were sending our children to schools to acquire the skills necessary to succeed in society, Indigenous parents were having their children pulled from their arms and sent to institutions designed to strip them of their language and culture, to turn them from people who had rights and title into just another ethnic visible minority. As we exercised our constitutional right to move within Canada, to pursue economic opportunities, Indigenous people were left with the legacy of environmental degradation of their ancestral lands. And as we point fingers and debate whether it was the government, the church, Canadian society as a whole, or a few sick individuals who were responsible for the atrocities committed against Indigenous children in residential schools, Indigenous people have been left to live with the legacy of intergenerational trauma. And as we continue to assert that fee simple lands are not on the treaty table, Indigenous people point to the incredible wealth that others have derived from lands within the boundaries of their original reserves. And as we celebrated a tourism campaign proclaiming supernatural British Columbia, Indigenous people were left to mourn the loss of countless transformer sites and sacred places that were destroyed or damaged to make way for railways, highways, and urban development. As we have been being Hualitum, the hungry ones, Indigenous people have been struggling to remove the mislabel of being Indians and to be recognized as Huelmoch, people of life. I look forward to a day when the Stalo people might no longer call me and other settlers in their territory Hualitum, the hungry ones. When we might have shown through our actions that we respect Indigenous rights, that we're willing to share authority, and that we're willing to take meaningful steps to right past wrongs. Some of our predecessors worked hard to develop just such a shared vision in the early 1860s, but we let it be stolen away. The question now is, what action are we willing to take to reclaim that vision? Thank you very much.